Never back down. Tien's words echo powerfully in episode 17, as she dares to face a new challenge, breaking every limit in her path to a life of freedom. In the soft, muted light of early morning, Tu Tien sat quietly on the porch of a small, stilt house nestled deep within the village, the place she had moved to just over a week ago. No more yelling from a mother-in-law, no more cruel words from Tien, no more anxiety from living as someone merely tolerated. There was only the whisper of wind rustling through the trees and her own heart, still a little lost, but slowly beginning to find peace. She tightened the knot of her old headscarf, then stepped down the wooden stairs. Today was important. She planned to gather wild banana leaves to sell to Mr. and Mrs. Sao, who made gai cakes for the local markets. She had met them a few days earlier and was kindly offered one to try, so she wanted to repay their warmth by contributing ingredients. Her footsteps were quiet as she walked the narrow trails shaded by banana trees, her hands deftly selecting the broad, unblemished leaves. When she reached their home, the sweet scent of freshly steamed gai cakes drifted through the air. Mrs. Sao greeted her cheerfully, still busy wrapping cakes while chatting away. "Quen brought beautiful leaves today. Our cakes will taste even better," she laughed, using the new name the villagers had given Tu Tien. She smiled softly, choosing not to correct them. Perhaps starting a new life with a new name wasn't such a bad thing after all. After helping Mrs. Sao sort the leaves and wrap the cakes, Tu Tien sat down to enjoy one. The rich, fragrant sweetness mixed with the soft, sticky texture reminded her of holidays past, moments of laughter mixed with heartache. Quietly, she pulled a few small bills from her pocket and tucked them carefully into the folds of her scarf. That scarf was no longer just a shield from sun and rain. It had become her makeshift savings bank, a simple but determined gesture of resilience. Tu Tien left the small house with the last bundle of banana leaves in hand, her heart heavy yet softened. She was no longer a cast-aside wife. She was slowly becoming an independent woman, quiet but strong. The mountain breeze slipped through her clothes, carrying mist and a whisper of hope. Her steps back home were light as silk, but inside she knew she was walking more firmly than ever. On the way back, she stopped by a small stream, rinsed her hands and watched the water bubble over the rocks. The mud washed away easily, but the wounds inside would take longer. She looked up at the thick green canopy above and smiled. That afternoon, the heat was stifling, almost unbearable, but Tu Tien's heart was strangely calm. She walked slowly along the dirt road leading to the village community house, where, in just a few minutes, her divorce from Ly Tu Tien would be officially finalized. The sunlight glared against her face, and her eyes blinked not from fatigue, but from holding back the tears threatening to fall. Before coming here, she had stopped by the village chief's home to ask about the progress of the case. The upright and kind-hearted man had carefully opened his notebook, looked up and quietly said, "The court has reached a decision. Come to the community house this afternoon to receive the outcome, 2 o'clock. Tien nodded without a word, but inside a voice echoed, "At last, it's over." At exactly 2 o'clock in the modest community house, everyone was present. Tien sat across the table, eyes avoiding hers, while his mother, Mrs. Phuc, sat with her legs crossed, barely concealing her smugness. Next to her was a flashy-looking woman unfamiliar to Tu Tien. Tien's new bride, the shadowy figure who had haunted the final days of Tu Tien's former life. The village chief opened the official document and read in a firm, measured tone, "The People's Court of the district has officially approved the divorce between Ly Tu Tien and Tu Tien. As of today, the two are no longer legally husband and wife. All assets, including ducks, pigs and buffalo, remain under the ownership of Mr. Tien's family. Mr. Tu Tien has made no request for division of property." Tien kept his head down. Mrs. Phuc smirked and leaned over to whisper to the new bride, "It's done. We'll throw you a real wedding now." Tu Tien didn't look at anyone. She simply bowed her head to the village chief. "Thank you for helping me through this. I'm free now." Her voice was soft, but her gaze was resolute. She didn't need wealth. She didn't need apologies. All she had ever wanted was freedom. As she left the community house, she didn't look back. Tien made a move to stand, as if to call her, but then sank back into his seat, defeated. Mrs. Phuc was already chatting excitedly about wedding plans, as if what had just occurred was nothing more than a routine transaction. Tu Tien's feet touched the ground outside, and in that moment it felt as if she had left behind an entire chapter of darkness. She was no longer the castaway. She was a woman who had chosen her own life. And under the golden light of that late afternoon, Tu Tien smiled, the smile of someone who had finally reclaimed her destiny. The morning after her divorce, the village chief stopped by Tu Tien's small home. His gaze was kind, and though his voice was calm, there was quiet strength behind every word. "I know you've been through a lot," he said, placing a few temporary residence documents on her bamboo table. "But here, no one looks down on you. Live the rest of your life the way you bravely stepped out of the shadows, blend in with the community. Who knows, maybe new happiness will find its way to you." Tu Tien nodded without speaking, but in her eyes something had softened. After the chief left, she walked with him to the porch and stood there silently for a long moment. The fresh morning air brushed gently through her hair. The simple sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, distant bird song, made her feel like she had just laid down a heavy stone that had pressed on her chest for far too long. It had been ages since she felt such quiet peace. Meanwhile, a few kilometers away, Jack, the ever-busy CEO, had just wrapped up work at the construction site and stopped at a local store. He picked up a few essentials, a bag of rice, flu medicine, shampoo, body wash, and some small packets of biscuits. Everything was neatly packed into a simple cloth bag, which he carried as if it was something precious. Without hesitation, he drove straight to the stilt house near the village where he knew Tu Tien was living alone. When he arrived, he stood at the door and called out gently, but there was no answer. His eyes scanned the area, clearly uneasy. Unable to leave just yet, Jack sat on a wooden bench outside the house, resting his chin on his hand, deep in thought. He searched around, circled the house quietly, waited on the porch, hoping. But time passed and his phone kept vibrating with urgent calls from the site. Eventually he stood up, placed the cloth bag neatly at the door, left without a name, without a note. Later that evening, Tien returned home after gathering vegetables. Just as she reached the porch, she stopped. The unfamiliar bag sat there, modest, tidy. She opened it, found every item inside carefully chosen, practical and familiar, and her heart tightened. She knew who had left it. She sat down, held the bag to her chest and looked up at the tall green bamboo swaying in the wind. A quiet warmth filled her chest. In a world that had once felt so cold, she realized, someone was still silently thinking of her. That morning, the sky was heavy and grey, as if foreshadowing something unusual. On local news channels, updates about Tropical Storm No. 3 were running non-stop. Images of heavy rain, fierce winds and flooding in nearby provinces stirred unease among the people. For highland areas like the village where Tu Tien now lived, storms didn't just mean rain, they meant landslides, flash floods, power outages, and the terrifying risk of being completely cut off. At the headquarters of the construction company where Jack served as CEO, an emergency meeting was underway. Standing at the head of the table, his eyes serious and his voice firm, Jack laid out the action plan. All projects are to halt immediately. Site leaders must evacuate workers and equipment to safety, postpone material deliveries, reinforce scaffolding in high-risk zones, and put up clear warning signs. Medical staff are to remain on duty 24/7. A concerned engineer asked, "What about the project deadlines, sir?" Jack paused briefly, then answered with absolute clarity, "Deadlines can be made up later. But if we lose even one life, that can't ever be replaced. Safety is our top priority." The meeting ended in urgency, everyone quickly moving into action. Jack, after coordinating all necessary tasks, left the office with a bag in hand. No one knew that his next destination was a small house deep in the forest, the place where a woman he deeply cared for lived quietly on her own. By the time he arrived, the first drops of rain had started to fall. Jack put on his cap and stepped into the porch with the bag. Tu Tien, who had been cutting vegetables under the shelter of the eaves, startled at the sight of him. "Jack?" she said in surprise. "The storm's coming," he said. "I brought you some essentials, cold medicine, shampoo and some food. Please don't go outside when it gets worse. It's dangerous up here. She took the bag with both hands, her eyes filled with emotion. Thank you for thinking of me. They shared a simple meal, just a bowl of vegetable soup, a bit of dried fish and warm rice. But in that moment, the space between them felt warmer than any elaborate setting. No one mentioned Tien. No one needed to say much at all. Tu Tien watched the rain fall beyond the porch, then looked down and smiled softly. The past had finally closed its chapter. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain. Today she no longer felt alone. And in the steady rhythm of the rain, a quiet warmth settled into her chest. Not loud, not grand, but just enough to plant the first seed of hope. Tropical storm Yagi had made landfall. Rain poured in torrents and the wind howled fiercely through the fragile, thatched roof of the stilt house. The bamboo walls creaked and groaned with each gust. Tu Tien huddled in the corner of the kitchen. The fire had long gone out, and her freezing hands still tried to slice the last bit of papaya she had left. Lunch that day was simple. A bit of fried egg, young papaya soup, and a leftover guy cake from the day before. But she didn't complain, because at the very least she still had a roof over her head. Outside, the rain hadn't let up. From a distance, the sound of a car pulling up startled her. She looked up to see Jack, wearing his white safety helmet, stepping onto the porch with a bag in his arms. Rain had soaked his shoulders, but he still smiled gently and asked, "Have you eaten yet?" Tu Tien quickly stood, wiping her dirt-covered hands on her pant leg, flustered. "It's pouring so hard. Why did you come all the way here?" Jack set the bag on the table and pulled out shampoo, a few cans of milk, some biscuits. "I was worried you wouldn't go out to buy anything. In this weather, landslides are a real risk." She looked at the items as if they were a mountain sheltering her from the storm. Her heart tightened, her nose stung. These simple gestures, quiet, unannounced, without pride, felt warmer than any promise she had ever been given. No one had ever braved a storm just to show her this kind of care. Jack sat beside her. She invited him to share her humble meal, trying to hide the emotion in her eyes. When he picked up a piece of fried egg and placed it in her bowl, his voice was soft as the wind. "You don't have to wear that headscarf all the time. Your hair, it's beautiful." Tu Tien instinctively pulled back, her hand brushing against the scarf, the one she had used for so long to hide her pain and her tears. And today, for the first time, she felt like taking it off. They ate in silence, the rain falling steadily outside, but the air between them was anything but cold. When Mr. Quan, the former owner of the farm Jack had bought, arrived to ask about taking back his chicken, Jack simply smiled, placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Let Quan raise it. I'll give you 2.4 million. Tu Tien's eyes widened in surprise, about to speak, but Jack shook his head gently, signaling her to stay quiet. He didn't want her to know that he was the new owner. When Mr. Quan left, they sat together watching the rain. Tu Tien turned to Jack, her voice soft. "Thank you for coming." And in her glistening eyes there was no longer pain, only the warmth of a woman who, for the first time, felt what it meant to be truly protected.
Cô phải rời đi trong tủi nhục, trong sự lạnh lùng của người chồng. Trong ánh mắt khinh bỉ của cả gia đình chồng, cô muốn phản kháng, muốn hỏi chiến rằng anh ta còn chút tình nghĩa nào dành cho cô không. Nhưng rồi cô nhận ra điều đó chẳng cô quan trọng nữa. Cô chỉ là một món đồ bị vứt đi, bị thay thế bởi một người khác. Từ Tiên bước ra khỏi căn nhà đã từng là tổ ấm của mình, bước chân cô nặng nề như có ai đó trói chặt. Trời không mưa như làm cô bão tố, những giọt nước mắt mặn chát lăn nhài trên má hòa vào nỗi đau đớn cùng của một người phụ nữ bị phản bội. Vô chẳng mang gì ngoài bộ quần áo cũ kỹ, trái tim vỡ nát. Bóng lưng cô nhỏ bé đơn độc giữa con đường làng quen thuộc, nhưng giờ đây lại xa lạ vô cùng. Cô không biết mình sẽ đi đâu, sẽ làm gì. Tất cả những gì cô từng có, từng gìn giữ suốt năm qua, giờ đây chẳng còn thuộc về cô nữa. Có lẽ điều đau đớn nhất không phải là bị đuổi khỏi nhà, mà nhận ra rằng mình chưa bao giờ thực sự được xem là một phần của nơi đó. Cô đã từng cố gắng, từng nhẫn nhịn, nhưng rốt cuộc cô vẫn chỉ là người dân.